My name is Lynn Gentile, and I'm representing the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights today. And I just want to give everyone a warm welcome and just say that it's a pleasure for OHCHR to have been able to co-sponsor this event, along with the permanent mission of Spain to the United Nations, PLWRD, Rare Diseases International, and the NGO Committee for Rare Diseases. And the first, perhaps the most important thing I wanted to stress is that OHCHR stands in solidarity with the rare diseases movement. And we register our support today, not just for this event, but also for continuing to raise awareness and to search together for ways in which we can work to promote the human rights of persons living with rare diseases. Now, I won't go into many sort of technical details. We're going to hear from this, about this from the experts. But I just wanted to look at the two sort of cornerstone commitments which the 2030 agenda makes, among others. The commitment to leave no one behind, and also to reach first those who are furthest behind. So when we look at the numbers, the rare diseases community comes to around 4% of the global population. And this is several times the population of Switzerland. So, an enormous population. And yet we see that persons living with rare diseases have been left behind to quite an extraordinary degree. And so as we're taking stock, halfway through the 2030 agenda, persons living with rare diseases they're not yet able to enjoy the promise of not being left behind. And women living with or affected by rare diseases must surely be some of the furthest behind. Now, gender equality is it's a foundational human rights norm, and there's no human rights-based approach either to health or to social protection or whatever, which can be complete or even correct without gender equality running as a golden thread throughout all interventions. Now, as we know too well, the rhetoric is often far behind the progress on the ground. And this is true of gender equality in relation to health, as well as to other rights, which are particularly prone to violation when we think about persons living with rare diseases. It's also true that hard-won gains are frequently vulnerable to loss, and this calls for vigilance and for a proactive approach to ring-fencing those gains. Now, the numerous reverses in this area due to the COVID-19 pandemic, they've showed just how fragile gender equality has always been, and also how entrenched gender discrimination remains. For example, if we look at the impact on women's right to work, the right of women to just and fair conditions of work, the situation is still dire today. Now, this new normal, which came about as a result of the pandemic, even if it shouldn't be so, this new normal is very much the lived experience for women who have caring roles, either as mothers or who are carers for other members of the family. So they're very significant protection gaps, especially when we look at social protection for women. And we know that this protective system is especially indispensable for women living with rare diseases or supporting or caring for somebody with rare diseases. So I think what we, one of the biggest things we also want to emphasize is that social protection supports and enables the exercise of a variety of rights. So it supports the exercise of the right to education, the right to work, the right to health. And we know that girls are already far behind boys in access to education. So this sets them up for a lifetime of diminished opportunity, basically all along the life course and in every area. But the gaps don't stop here. They're very serious structural issues that we know about, and these create formidable barriers for women to be able to live in dignity and to enjoy their human rights. So the call we want to make here really is nothing short of a call for social justice. But for this, we need to mobilize more political commitment for the protection of the rights of women living with rare diseases, women affected by rare diseases, and girls. So I think when we think about the human rights principle of participation and the principle of inclusion, we know that the best source of evidence for how to approach some of these issues is the women and girls who are affected. And their voices need amplifying, and we need accountability from the duty bearers for delivering on their human rights. We're going to have we're going to hear today from some of the foremost experts in this area. We're going to hear a lot about what lies, the vulnerabilities that lie at the intersection of gender inequality on the one hand and rare diseases on the other. So we're going to hear from Ana Peláez Narváez, and she's recently been appointed Vice President of the CEDAW Committee. So we're really delighted to have her here as well. We know we're going to have a strong voice talking to us about these issues, not only from, can I say, a technical perspective, but also as a woman also. I think we do bring a certain degree of lived experience to some of these things in a small sense. And then we're also going to hear from Durhane Wong-Rieger, I hope I said that correctly, President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Diseases. And we'll also hear from Flaminia Macchia, and she's the Executive Director of Rare Diseases International. We also have a really interesting lineup, an exciting panel of speakers. And I was quite pleased to see that obviously we're going to hear from people who have lived experience, and that always promises to be an interesting discussion. I mentioned Flaminia a moment ago, and she did something interesting today. She sent me a list of a participant profile. And one of the things I noticed is we've got researchers, academia, we've got private sector people. And I'm hoping today that we'll not only have an inspiring discussion, but that this exchange will lead to some practical action. I'm thinking about things like, we talk about some of the rare diseases as being orphan diseases. Nobody feels motivated to put in the investment that's needed for R&D. But we also know that during the COVID crisis, I think there was a billionaire made every 26 seconds. And I'm willing to bet that if we can move the passions of some people with money, we can get somebody to adopt some of these rare diseases and really start, to move us from having discussions to having discussions that actually result in something. So I'm throwing out a challenge out there to anyone who has the possibility, the influence, to think about what we can do to improve healthcare for some of the people with rare diseases. We discuss and we speak, and we need to do this because awareness raising is important. We can't get people onto the same page as us if they don't know what we're talking about. But we do need to make sure that things like healthcare follow. And I think some of us are in a stronger position to be able to fund R&D. And that's really what's on my heart today, is if we could look at doing that as well. Thank you very much. Thank you, Flaminia.
Un saludo muy cordial para todo el mundo. Mi nombre es Ana Peláez Narváez y soy vicepresidenta del Comité CEDAW de Naciones Unidas. Muchísimas gracias por ofrecerme esta oportunidad para compartir con todos ustedes algunas reflexiones sobre el impacto que ha tenido la pandemia del COVID-19 en las mujeres y niñas con enfermedades raras y de cómo realmente deberían de estar consideradas en todos los programas y recuperación de esta situación de pandemia. Abordar esta cuestión supone plantear desde el primer momento de qué manera el COVID-19 ha impactado en estas mujeres y niñas con enfermedades raras. Está claro que apenas se conoce precisamente los efectos del COVID-19 en determinadas enfermedades raras, lo que realmente ha venido ocasionando un sesgo de género y de discapacidad en la asignación de recursos y en la atención especializada de salud de la población de mujeres y niñas con enfermedades raras. Lo que tenemos también claro es que ha existido una carga igualmente desproporcionada que han asumido estas mujeres con enfermedades raras o a lo mejor incluso madres de personas con enfermedades raras durante todo el proceso de la pandemia con respecto al tema de cuidados. Por eso es muy importante tomar medidas de prevención y medidas que realmente garanticen el acceso de las mujeres con enfermedades raras a programas de detección precoz, por ejemplo, del COVID-19, o programas incluso que nos permitan conocer el impacto que tiene el COVID-19 en determinadas enfermedades raras e incluso en la respuesta que se está ofreciendo con respecto, por ejemplo, al uso de determinados medicamentos. Es, por tanto, imprescindible que se difunda información sobre este particular, no solamente, desde luego, a las propias mujeres, niñas, familiares de personas con enfermedades raras, sino también a todo el personal de salud. Hay que garantizar precisamente que los servicios de salud, particularmente los servicios de salud sexual y reproductiva, realmente estén siempre disponibles, lo que no ha sido el caso para estas mujeres y niñas con enfermedades raras, teniendo en cuenta, por ejemplo, no solamente las cuestiones vinculadas con las propias enfermedades raras, sino las cuestiones de género, del hecho de realmente conocer cuáles son las necesidades particulares, por ejemplo, que pueden necesitar las mujeres y niñas con enfermedades raras con respecto, por ejemplo, a servicios de ginecología, de obstetricia, servicios, por ejemplo, de maternidad. Hay que garantizar igualmente el acceso confidencial sobre la salud sexual y reproductiva y sobre los servicios específicos, métodos, por ejemplo, anticonceptivos modernos como el aborto, el posaborto seguro para las mujeres y niñas con enfermedades raras. Garantizar el pleno consentimiento previo, libre e informado para cualquier intervención médica es fundamental, lo que no siempre se ha hecho, particularmente en situaciones, por ejemplo, de pandemia por la propia urgencia que la respuesta al COVID-19 ha ocasionado en muchos momentos. Como les comentaba, en todo este proceso es imprescindible formar al personal sanitario para garantizar precisamente que este consentimiento previo, libre e informado para cualquier intervención médica, para cualquier tratamiento, incluidos evidentemente todos los relacionados con el COVID-19 o con otras pandemias que se puedan dar, estén a disposición de todo el personal sanitario. Bueno, en tercer lugar, creo que es necesario proteger a las mujeres y niñas con enfermedades raras de la violencia. Todos y todas hemos conocido el impacto desproporcionado que la pandemia, el confinamiento, etcétera, ha tenido en las mujeres y muy particularmente en esas mujeres pertenecientes a grupos desfavorecidos, que es en donde se podrían incluir las mujeres y niñas con enfermedades raras. El riesgo de la pandemia ha sido particularmente
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Dolores. I am RDI's Public Affairs Manager. And I want to start off with just thanking again the first two ladies that spoke during this event. Thank you so much to Ms. Lynn Gentile from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights section. Of course, they are one of the co-hosts to this event, so we really, really thank them for that. And of course, to Ms. Ana Peláez Narváez, whom we also congratulate for her recent election to the position of Vice President of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, otherwise known as CEDAW. So before we continue, I just want to pause the event for a second. You can see the agenda on your screen. We're now going to actually enter the panel discussion. We're going to start off with 5 opening videos where the panelists will introduce themselves. They're going to introduce their relation to rare diseases and to gender. We'll then have the live panel discussion, and we have some time for Q&A. Before we continue, though, I just want to put us in the right headspace and try to link the keynote address with the following panel discussion. Ms. Peláez brought up so many important points, and I think the one kind of word that really segues us into the panel discussion is really intersectionality. We can use intersectionality as an analytical framework to understand how different aspects of a person's identity can either add or subtract, or sometimes perhaps both, from a person's discrimination or privilege. In the case of the population we are speaking about today, women and girls who are persons living with a rare disease or their caregivers, they face discrimination and stigma based on at least A, their gender, and B, their own or their loved one's health status as a person living with a rare disease. So without further ado, let's continue the discussion and hear from the panelists.
My name is Wong-Rieger from Lesotho. I established Rare Disease Lesotho Association, NGO, in 2017 and has been running since. I'm also a Ehlers-Danlos syndrome patient. I have struggled for years to get my diagnosis, and this is where my discrimination started. When you're not diagnosed, the chances of you being discriminated against in society by the medical professionals and everything else around you are high, especially if you have an invisible rare disease, because most of our symptoms are not necessarily seen and you can only feel the pain yourself, and tests usually come back negative. And for most people, such as myself, it will take you then multiple years just to get your diagnosis, especially being from a third world country, of which even basic, well, normal medical conditions don't always have the right materials to help those living with them, and they have to sort it out elsewhere. Like most of our patients need to go to South Africa for their treatments, and that is another problem on its own. So with that said, we as rare disease warriors face a lot of discrimination, especially being a woman. There's already an unfortunate discrimination for just being a woman and people taking you seriously. Now, being a woman living with a rare condition, it is so much tougher for you to use your voice and be vocal. And I remember one day my mom was telling me to listen to the doctors and just take whatever they bring in. And this was way before I got diagnosed, and I could tell that they were doing something wrong and that they were not giving me the attention I needed. And I spoke up, and I remember telling my mom, if I do not speak up and voice out, I am going to die on this bed. And no one else will feel like they're responsible for my life once I die, because I would have kept quiet and not done anything about it. And there's so many people out there who are voiceless and don't have the capacity or the knowledge to speak up for themselves. And this is when I realized how much, as a woman, a very young woman at that, why and how we're very discriminated against. And 2020 got worse when now Corona came up, and nobody cared about it. Well, in the medical facilities, if it wasn't about COVID, no one paid attention to any other kind of patient. And that was so unfortunate because rare condition patients couldn't then travel from Lesotho to South Africa for their appointments, which made it really hard. As we speak now, I have patients within the association who only this year have went to a checkup in 2 years. And that just to say, for those who don't have access to things, may have not actually seen doctors in 2 years, which is not right.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of estimated nearly 2 million women and girls with bleeding diseases globally. My name is Baiba Ziemel. I'm a passionate patient advocate from Latvia. I am a woman with a bleeding disorder. I was born with von Willebrand disease. It expresses similarly to hemophilia with various bleeding episodes in the skin, internal organs, joints, and muscles. I'm saying estimated 2 million because majority of women with bleeding disorders are not yet diagnosed. Out of nearly 350,000 people with bleeding disorders identified globally, only 24% are women and girls. For each man suffering with hemophilia, 1.5 women should be diagnosed with hemophilia. But out of all registered people with hemophilia, only 5% are women. Few years ago, scientists agreed that anyone who has less than 40% factor level in their blood should be diagnosed with bleeding disorder. Until that, only men could have proper diagnosis and women were considered only carriers. Delay for women's diagnosis is between 8 and 16 years, resulting in limited evidence of how bleeding disorders really affect women and girls daily. Lack of recognition leads to lack of treatment, and also that adding to the stigma and various cultural, social, and medical problems for marriage and having children. While we take care of our sons, brothers, and fathers, many of us suffer monthly with no medical help or even die from excessive bleed during or after childbirth. Approximately 1 in 5 women who presents to a gynecologist with heavy menstrual bleeding has an underlying bleeding disorder, but often remains undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. Many of us choose not to have children due to fear of passing on the gene or risk of dying from a bleed. Excessive bleeding during menstruations leaves many of us at the risk of period poverty because we can't afford enough hygiene products. Many of us feel too sick from this burden. We live with anemia and depression. We can't go to work and school. The gender inequality in our community is huge and we can't tackle it alone. On one hand, COVID-19 pandemics helped us to become more connected as community, sparkling more conversations and sharing knowledge and experiences online. We had 2 successful global summits for women and girls with bleeding disorders, helping to reach those people who would not otherwise be able to attend conferences. But on the other hand, it also hit hard on the access to already limited medical help. In many places, specialist care and various medical services were stopped. We need to harmonize and improve diagnostic possibilities and access to treatment globally. But the first step is recognition of our issues and the fact that women bleed too. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Adrian Fisher. I'm an academic at the University of Cambridge and I run a program around the advocating support for rare disease families. My backdrop is I'm a parent of 4 children and one of whom is quite rare, and his condition was actually discovered through a screening program, genetic screening program that was actually carried out in Cambridge. And my involvement in this panel, which is a fantastic opportunity, I think, is highlighting some of the gender equalities that we've come across in our sort of education programs that we've been running around rare diseases and advocating at the same time. And it became really clear very quickly once we had George, our youngest child, that there was a difference in behaviour between if I took George out into the community and my wife took George out, Gilda. George's mum, took George out into the community. And it was quite stark, actually. Gilda would experience quite a lot of snide, unpleasant comments, whereas people would be relatively normal, in inverted commas, with me. So we even at a very early stage, we saw some cases of Gilda being treated quite differently to myself. And as that grew, we were one of these families that sort of ended up as a sort of internet story. My youngest lost a cuddly toy, and there was this big search, and it became a really large story across a lot of the media and the rest of it. And we had this lovely outpouring of of kindness, with lots of toys and lots of gifts coming to George. But we also had, of course, the other side of that on the social media platforms, of a few individuals that were perhaps less kind, and some were saying that the kid, he should be killed, must be killed because he's different, and the mother should be sterilised, and these are quite shocking. And I remember Gilda's reaction to those being really quite horrified, and it was interesting to see that brazen sort of discrimination that seems to be embedded in people's reactions to children with rare diseases, and of course more broadly as well. So it'd be fantastic. I'm looking forward to finding out more about what other panelists have experienced and general discussion. In terms of the COVID sort of a situation, we were, I think we found that things have generally deteriorated. There's less tolerance in the community, and more unfriendly comments coming back at children broadly with rare diseases. And for us, it's more about trying to bring forward education and promote social inclusion broadly across genders and everything. So that's really where we're coming from today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So thank you.
Un paciente con enfermedad rara en América Latina y en todo el mundo necesita tener acceso a un diagnóstico. Antes que el diagnóstico, incluso al tamizaje neonatal, de preferencia ampliado, que pueda captar esas enfermedades incluso antes de tener los síntomas. No solo debemos focalizarnos en el tamizaje neonatal o en el diagnóstico o en el tratamiento de los pacientes. Tendríamos que focalizarnos en prevenir las enfermedades poco frecuentes con una consejería genética, con educación a la población que pueda evitar que podamos tener más casos que podrían ser manejados de otra forma. En América Latina no estamos ajenos de todas las necesidades que tienen los pacientes con enfermedades raras. En Perú, por ejemplo, tenemos la ley que declara de interés nacional y preferente la atención de los pacientes con enfermedades raras. Sin embargo, a casi 10 años de su promulgación, todavía no hemos implementado la ley y todavía los pacientes no están teniendo acceso a diagnóstico y a tratamiento. Cabe resaltar que todas las enfermedades raras no tienen tratamiento, entonces se necesita mucha investigación para poder hacer que las enfermedades raras puedan tener un tratamiento y que puedan evitar que los pacientes lleguen a la muerte o se discapaciten. En el caso de las mujeres, lo que nosotros hemos observado es que mayormente, cerca del 99% de los cuidadores son mujeres. Por lo tanto, necesitan un soporte especial porque van a tener que dejar de trabajar en la mayoría de casos para poder atender a sus niños con enfermedad rara. Los gobiernos deberían atender esta necesidad, presentar programas de subsidios, por ejemplo, para hacer que estas madres puedan atender con la tranquilidad y con toda la plenitud a ese niño o a esa niña que padece enfermedad poco frecuente. En el caso de las mujeres padeciendo enfermedades poco frecuentes, lo que hemos observado es que ellas reportan tener mayor dificultad para estudiar, para poder estudiar una profesión o para incluso ejercer una carrera. Por lo tanto, el grupo de mujeres es vulnerado y no incluido a todos los sentidos en este tema tan importante. Creemos que tiene que haber una política nacional específica, transversal, para apoyo a todas las mujeres y sobre todo apoyar a aquellas mujeres que están padeciendo de alguna enfermedad y de alguna enfermedad rara en especial, porque tiene todo un trasfondo mayor, ¿no? La enfermedad rara puede demorar hasta 8 años de media en ser diagnosticada y esto ocasiona un grave perjuicio en la salud de la paciente y del paciente y por lo tanto necesita tener un tratamiento específico para ello y mejorar y brindar todo el acceso necesario.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Moushami Matsudi from the Department of Molecular and Human Genetics, Banaras Hindu University. My research interest includes identification of causal variants for rare disorders, particularly motor neuron disorders and congenital ocular disorder. The Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, they have formulated a national policy for treatment of rare disorders in 2017, and more recently this policy was updated, that is in 2021. In the field of rare disorder, as all of us know, it's very complex and heterogeneous, and what happens is, other than a few handful of rare disease, the understanding of the pathogenesis is still at its infancy. In the Indian scenario, unfortunately, the data on rare disease is lacking, and thus this impedes our understanding of the burden of rare disease in our country. All around the globe, we come across discrimination. Children affected by rare disorders, they have a Herculean task to be integrated into the regular schooling system. They have to face obstacles at each and every step of their education. Social inclusion is also a problem for people who are affected by rare disease. And in addition, families and persons living with rare disease face challenge in maintaining decent work and have a greater risk for hardship due to the increased cost of care for a child with rare disease. Women, in addition, experience gender inequality and stigma as persons living with rare disease. Addressing the challenges of persons living with a rare disease, in the General Assembly recently, they have recalled the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. We as individuals as well as a society are deeply concerned that the coronavirus pandemic disease, that is COVID-19 pandemic, has enhanced the existing inequalities, and those at particular risk are women and girls, and they are in an increased vulnerable situation. We urgently need to eliminate the barriers preventing participation of individuals affected with rare disease in every walk of life. For people with rare disorders, equity relates to opportunity, non-discrimination in education, at work, equitable access to healthcare, and finally, social acceptance.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much to the amazing panelists for their introductions. They're really an amazing group, aren't they? So now we're just going to go straight into the live panel discussion. If you have any burning questions, which I'm sure you probably will have, please keep them towards the end of the panel discussion where we can answer them, and then they can all kind of gather at the bottom of the chat. Otherwise, they get lost in everybody's comments. Natabeling, I want to actually start with you. You mentioned that you started feeling discriminated against whilst you were still undiagnosed and didn't know you were living with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. You even felt like you were going to die if you didn't speak up. Do you think your experience attaining a diagnosis, otherwise known as your diagnostic journey, would have been different if you were a man?
Yes, I actually do believe that if I was a man, I would have had a different experience. And I'm going to demonstrate an event that happened when I was in university. I was having what I now know was a gastric paralysis attack, where your intestines get paralyzed or not. So your tummy tends to be very big and you look like you're pregnant. The first thing the doctor said when he looked at me, in fact, without actually asking me how I felt or why I came to see him, he first asked, am I sure I'm not pregnant? Which was very offensive for someone who is in pain and wants to know what's wrong with them. You can't just, straight away say you must be pregnant without checking or asking. There was no test done, let alone any questions as to how I feel and how long it has been since I had that particular symptoms. So I just personally believe that if it was a man of the same issue, same diagnostics, they probably would have rushed them straight to a hospital, because it didn't make sense that one would be that swollen, because it doesn't look like a normal bloating. It literally looks like I'm 8 months pregnant. And if I was not looking like that a day before, any doctor would be alarmed as to why would someone's stomach grow that fast instantly within less than 48 hours. And there's a list of incidents where no doctor took me seriously. I even gotten said to be a hypochondriac and sent to a mental institution instead of a medical hospital, only to find out that all of that was just my diagnosis of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome years later. And I think if I had known earlier when I started my symptoms, I would have probably avoided a lot of problems. And there's been cases where I was in ICU and I almost died. And all of that would have been prevented if I was taken more seriously when I did announce my symptoms in the beginning.
Thank you, Natabaling. Thank you so much for sharing.
And it actually be more possible than they.
Thank you, Durhane. It actually takes a lot of bravery to share these stories, and thank you again, Natabaling, and actually to all of the panelists for being brave enough to stand here and speak. Baiba, you said, and I quote, "We need to harmonize and improve diagnostic possibilities and access to treatment." That is what you offered as one of the steps to alleviating the gender discrimination that women and girls living with a bleeding disorder experience. Do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has, or rather I should say is, it's still ongoing, making that harder to achieve?
I think it is, because throughout the world, we have, over these 2 years, we have developed new guidelines for hemophilia treatment and also new guidelines for von Willebrand disease treatment. And the problem is that each country considers these diseases differently. Just like the previous speakers just said, that people usually don't realize that these are symptoms of some of the diseases. It's also the same for medical doctors. And when you can't recognize a symptom, then you can't put on a diagnosis. So you can't provide the treatment for a patient. And we have these global guidelines which request the minimum care for each bleeding disorder. And therefore, each country just like, and during the COVID, everyone was online. So basically, we have spent so many hours online that I have a feeling that actually nobody is taking more information. Like, we are soaked up with so much information that we just can't even read these new guidelines, and we don't even know that they exist. So it's very difficult to implement them. And because the high costs of treatments, of course, it's not realistic for each country. And I think it is something that we have to tackle together.
Thank you, Baiba. Thank you so much. And now, since we're mentioning the online virtual world that we are all living in basically now, Adrian, you told us specifically about the online gender discrimination that your wife faced after you shared your son George's story as a person living with a rare disease. As the only man on our panel here today, do you think that there are not enough male patient advocates standing up for persons living with a rare disease?
Well, thanks so much for the chance to speak to here today as the only male. That's a lovely thing. I mean, the program we were involved in is really around education and the emphasis about the digital domain and how that can really, I think, help open up opportunities and try and level the playing field to some extent. In terms of male involvement, I mean, our programs, what we tend to find is that people are coming back to us saying that actually, really, there's not so many male advocates, not because perhaps they don't want to stand up, but because actually day-to-day responsibility in caring, it does fall heavily on mothers. Whether that's cultural, whether that's societal, whether it's practical, you know, this is a reality. We also know that there is a proportion of family breakdowns, and in that situation, again, mothers will be the ones that are likely to take on the caring responsibilities of their child. So I think there is there's a day-to-day living experience of the challenges which is embedded within the mothers. It's not that the fathers aren't involved, we're definitely involved, but perhaps that day-to-day nitty-gritty is more proportionately understood by mothers. And so that is one of the things that where I think you don't perhaps get people like myself standing up and speaking so much, because the deep knowledge is held with the mothers. It's not to say that fathers aren't interested or in any way not involved. So I think that's a big challenge. And I threw this out to some of the groups that we deal with, and there was a comment from a male actually, which of surprise. You know, normally you just assume, you know, that a male will have a voice in a forum. You know, this is sort of something that's really well understood. And actually there was a surprise that more men weren't involved. And so perhaps forums like this are important to kind of emphasize that actually don't assume that, you know, there's a balance of opinions coming through. In gender equality, that's a kind of important thing. And forums like this are brilliant for doing that. And so, I mean, I really welcome the contribution that we can all make here today. So thanks for the question.
No, thank you, Adrian. And it's a good kind of transition to my question actually to Carla, because you just brought up the fact that it's usually women who are taking the main kind of caregiving role for children living with a rare disease. And Carla, you brought up the consequences that women face when they are caregivers to persons living with a rare disease. You even state that 99% of caregivers to this vulnerable population in South America are women. And by the way, we actually have statistics which show that COVID-19 has increased worldwide the caregiving burdens of women due to layoffs, lockdowns, school closures, and more. Carla, do you have any thoughts or input as to why are women so often the ones that take on the burden of caregiving for persons living with a rare disease?
Yes, Dolores, this is a role that in the study carried out by Esperanza, the Peruvian patient organization, we found that in the case of caregiver of children with rare diseases, 99% was the mother. A child with rare diseases may require special care. Many times needs full-time assistance. And in some countries, women for doing the same job as the men receive less money. So for this reason, families usually leave the father in his work activity and the mother assumes the role of the caregiver. Mothers of children with rare diseases face exceptional circumstances that influence their role as parents. Sometimes they overlap the role of caregivers with that of mothers. And to be able to live the experience without great anguish and overcome the fear, support and recognition is necessary.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you so much. And it's really powerful that you actually have some statistics coming out of countries, because that was one of the things that Ms. Peláez actually underlined is missing. Baiba, you gave us many facts and figures which show that women often receive a diagnosis for a bleeding disorder much later than men, that they fall through the cracks of treatment and care, and that they're not statistically accounted for. What do you, Baiba, think countries can start doing to make the diagnostic journey for women quicker and more successful?
I think it's the training of the doctors, because when there is a boy with hemophilia or somebody else who is bleeding, usually this person has mother and sisters or sometimes even daughters. And then it's the responsibility of the doctor to ask this woman if she has symptoms, and then accordingly send her to the treatment, diagnostic possibilities. And there are specifics what they have to take into account when diagnosing these women. For example, there are many symptoms, like we have the same symptoms as men with the bleeding disorders, the nose bleeds and all other kinds of the bleeds. But there's also this specific because of the role of a woman when you're giving the birth and having monthly bleedings, then it's also possible for your gynecologist to recognize somebody who has abnormal bleeding. And the medical community has come up with standards, what is the difference between a normal and abnormal bleeding. So therefore, education would be the first, awareness and education would be the first steps for each country to understand that there is this problem. And eventually solving these problems would help us decrease the number of maternal mortality, because many people are still dying during the childbirth and afterwards. So this is one of the most straightforward ways how to fix this problem.
Thank you, Baiba. Thank you so much. Speaking of doctors, Mushmi, you're the recipient of the very prestigious Serb Power Fellowship, which rewards outstanding female researchers in Indian academic institutions and research and development laboratories. What was it like to be honored as a female scientist in the field of rare diseases? Would you like to see more female scientists in this field?
Well, as you could see, that this is a very prestigious award, and I was really elated. But let me correct that the work I had done was just not on rare disorders, but also on identification of the molecular basis of other non-coding RNA and RNA binding proteins, which are required for disease and development. So basically, the work on rare disease which we have done is that there are a lot of families. So we are located in the northern region of India, and there are neighboring villages and people from poor communities, they come where, for example, we had cases of blindness in a family of 6 children. 3 were slowly losing eyesight, and they had no clue as to what was happening. And we took in this family and did a DNA diagnostic test by using next generation sequencing and identified the rare variant, the causal variant. So hopefully the work we are doing will help in early intervention, which is very, very important. And these mutations can be used as markers for prenatal diagnosis. So basically, what I feel is, for rare disorders, as some of the other panelists were saying, that identification at an early stage is very, very important. And that is lacking. And so that is where we have come in, and we are trying to help people who are not able to afford screening on their own, because it's a lot of money for people who are living below poverty. And so I feel happy that at least we can help them. And more recently, we are also working on new aspect, that is motor neuron disorders. Now, coming to whether I'll be happy with other people getting this fellowship and working on this, obviously, yes. But just not women. Even men are more welcome to join in. And so that we know that some of the diseases, some of the rare diseases, like a little bit groundwork has been done, but then there are others which are totally at its infancy, and more research should go into this aspect. In addition, what I feel is the funding bodies, like the public as well as the private funding bodies, they should come in and fund such kind of research. Like special calls should be there for rare disorders. And in that way, like all of us should join hands so that we can help in early intervention, which is much needed for these, like the children, particularly girls. What happens in this area is that the boys, the little boys, you know, they are expected to grow up and take care of the children, the parents when they grow old. And so what ultimately what happens is the girl child gets neglected. And especially with a rare disorder, this is even more devastating. So I feel that a lot of counseling has got to come in, and we should give directions to these such families, you know, so that the girl child can be helped out. Similarly, schools can come in where part of the curriculum should include individuals with rare disorders or any form of disability. And so basically the society at large is responsible, and it's just not the clinicians or the caregivers. It's all of us should join hands and try to help and expedite the diagnosis, as well as hopefully we can come to the therapies as well.
Yeah.
In the future.
Okay, thank you so much, Mushmia. It's true, there's a lot of work to do in this field. Speaking of work to do, Natabaling, you established the Rare Disease Lesotho Foundation. Through your personal journey and your time establishing this organization, have you seen any efforts in your country or your region to address gender discrimination for persons living with a rare disease and their caregivers?
Well, change, not as effective as I would like it, considering we've been active for 4 years, but there has been change in terms of speaking about rare conditions and awareness being raised, because we had way more problems in terms of, I remember one time, the stigma against the word rare, where people didn't want to be associated with the word rare, as though it meant there's something very wrong with one if they are considered rare. So now people are more open to talking about rare conditions, and that people with rare conditions are people and we have rights like everybody else, and they should be met in one way or the other. There's instances with rare conditions, which is quite unspoken of, that most rare conditions are invisible. And therefore, in comparison to most disabilities, you can't really see that one is sick from a naked eye. And therefore, the discrimination becomes more amplified. For example, most people with rare conditions can't go on a flight of stairs cases, for example. And you have people say, but aren't you too small to be using a lift instead of going up the stairs? You're lazy. You're too tiny to not be active. And it's like, well, my heart can't take me up the staircase. I can faint in 2 seconds. But now people are tending to be more accommodating to listening and not just having a whole perspective of, no, well, there's something wrong with you. And then there's also an area that is not spoken of. I'm not sure if everybody goes through this, but as third world countries, there's also a stigma of, I wouldn't call it witchcraft, but like superstitions. So people with rare conditions, unfortunately, there's a line of superstitions that go about. And I'm not, the lady who spoke about hemophilia, it said that the hemophilia patients, the parent carries the genetic mutation, the mother. Now there's a discrimination against women with kids with hemophilia in most countries, where it's said that they are the ones that bring the poison to the kids. And most times they get discriminated and cursed out by families because they said they brought the jinn into the family. And I'm not sure if people are aware of this, and this is quite bad. And I've seen it a lot in Lesotho, but it has changed now. People now understand that it can happen to absolutely anybody, even though these people are the ones that carry the gene or rather the mutation that is then displayed in the child when the child is born. So while it is a not here nor there, but there is a bit of an improvement in the past 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natabaling. Kadla, over to you again. You brought up an important issue which women who are persons living with a rare disease or their caregivers face, namely that of decreased economic independence and increased chances of impoverishment. You say, and I quote, "In the case of women suffering from an uncommon disease, we have observed that they have greater difficulty studying a career or even exercising a career." Do you think we can truly leave no one behind, which is, of course, the goal of Agenda 2030, the goal of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, including the ones that have brought us all here today? Do you think we can truly leave no one behind if we don't address this issue?
Dolores, with ALIVER, the Ibero-American Alliance for Rare Diseases, we developed a study for social and economic needs of people living with rare diseases. And some findings were those I commented. So 61% of women with rare diseases surveyed had a high impact of health and daily life. And then 48%, they greatly limited opportunity to have a job. And they really felt that has more needs. And I think we can truly leave no one behind by adopting a gender perspective, by providing greater support for governments, for women living with rare diseases, and also for their caregivers. I think we should give them psychological support, education, digital literacy, socioeconomical support, and then we could really be helpful for trying to give everybody the access for an assistance and the access for really impact in a better life for people living with rare diseases.
Thank you so much, Carla. Adrian, I wanted to ask you, what can individuals do to be allies to women who are persons living with a rare disease, or their families or their caregivers who are also women, and those that are facing gender discrimination? I ask you because obviously you are the father of a child who's living with a rare disease. You run a program which advocates for increased support for persons living with a rare disease and their families. And of course, you've personally witnessed gender discrimination of women as caregivers in this community.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I had a sort of thought process which is very similar to the previous speaker, actually, which is everything starts obviously with the birth and the surprise typically of not expecting perhaps a rare child and then no diagnosis. And so I think one of the really critical things is that very early stage where typically a mother will have taken some career break or be on maternity leave, but because things are different, there's a challenge there, that maternity leave becomes extended. The opportunities to return to work are reduced. Maybe people will try, of course, they will try to return to some their previous working relationships, but it's not easy. And I think that's one of the very critical moments, because most of us don't know we're managing a rare condition. The lack of diagnosis early on is a real challenge. But it kind of sets in motion a whole train of things that then lead to what we know: social deprivation, lack of education, lack of equality. And so I do think it's that very early stage, that sort of urgency. And I was trying to get some research funding for a program around neonatal intensive care, and they have a thing called the golden hour. The very first hour of birth is absolutely critical. How the children are treated in that first hour in NICU, neonatal intensive care, has an enormous impact on their life expectancy and their life quality. And it seems to me we lack urgency in these early months where you have a child, you can see something's not working, and we don't seem to throw the kitchen sink essentially at it and try and address the challenges that we know will follow if we don't get everything in place early on. And I think it's this lack of understanding and diagnosis and urgency at that stage, once you leave hospital, perhaps, which entrenches a lifelong change, which perhaps doesn't need to happen, will happen less if we could have a much greater sort of emphasis on support for those in those circumstances when a child's been born.
Okay, thank you so much, Adrian. So we are running slightly past our time here. So I think that with this, we're actually going to conclude the panel discussion. I really want to give a massive thank you to our panelists for all of their inputs, for the virtual audience, for so patiently and engagingly listening. We're now actually going to enter the last bit of our event by hearing some take-home messages from Ms. Durhane Wong-Rieger, who is the President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders and is also the chair of RDI's Council. We're also then going to finish off by hearing some closing remarks from Ms. Flaminia Macchia, who is RDI's Executive Director. Thank you so very much again to everyone. Durhane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will have to say, when Flaminia asked me whether I would be interested or willing to make some of these key messages, I thought it'd be a great opportunity. I have to say, I'm just overwhelmed with the discussion that's taken place so far. I mean, beginning with Lynn, Gentile, and really huge thanks to the Office of Human Rights for taking on this issue with us and for giving us the opportunity to explore it, because I think we all knew it was there. You know, gender is one of those things that we live with. And, you know, the sad thing that happens is we take it so for granted that, I mean, you just think of the word woman, right? I mean, the origins of the word woman is actually wife to the man or the servant to the man. You know, and you think about the origins of the whole, I mean, biblical story, you know, I mean, God made Adam in his image, and then he takes a rib out of Adam and he makes a woman. Like, really? I never think of myself as anybody's rib, but I think the world still looks through that lens, right? There's a man, and then there's this, you know, rib that's kind of become this helpmeet to the man. And it's almost unavoidable. And I listen to everybody's comments and their stories, and I'm going like, oh my gosh, of course, we're still living in that Garden of Eden where, you know, man was made in the image of God and woman is the helpmeet. And even worse than that, you know, in the Christian, it was the woman who kind of blew everything up and led everybody astray. And it is, I think, a change in terms of overall culture and mindset. And I listen to the discussions around stigma and discrimination. And I hear it strongly. It's not enough that we get rid of stigma for women especially, and I understand that in terms of genetic conditions. It's not enough that we get rid of the discrimination, but we do move towards, what about the equity? Where in fact we're able to have the same outcomes for men and women with rare diseases, girls and boys. But it's also, and I think this is why I was so pleased in terms of, you know, Lynn and her early presentation, it is a human rights issue. We cannot be fully human, and that was Doris's comment. Can we actually get to leave no one behind if we do not explicitly address the gender issue? And so this was such a wonderful, important discussion. And the comments that everybody had, I'm taken back to my early days as well with hemophilia. And I remember in the mid-90s, we hosted in Canada the first retreat for women with hemophilia. And it was still the height of HIV, it was still the height of hepatitis. And so a lot of attention around men, not just with bleeding disorders, but all the other tragedies around it, right? And it was the first time we said, all women, bring them together. They were wives, they were mothers, they were women obviously living with bleeding disorders themselves. And it's the first time these women said, we felt like we were being treated as real people ourselves. We were just helpmeets. We were just running alongside. We were taken care of. And we never even thought to consider for ourselves. And I mean, I never saw so many tears and so many revelations, for me especially, right? I mean, I was there certainly as president of the Hemophilia Society there, but also as psychologist. We wanted to make sure. We had no idea what we were prepared for. And I think it really was that whole recognition, you know, as many of you are talking about, that as a woman living with a rare condition, especially one that's dominated. I'll give you fast forward this past June for Fabry's, again, another excellent condition. Men are usually defined as having the disease. The treatments that came out, even in Canada today, it is almost exclusively for men, even though many women with Fabry's will suffer the same level of symptoms and actually benefit from the treatment. We do not give them the same access. And listening to the definition of what is considered to be factor levels. I mean, we use, again, male standards, right? So it is, I think, time for us to say, women with bleeding disorders are not just lesser versions of men with bleeding disorders. Women with a rare disease is not just some kind of a variant. We're not a genetic variant of a, much more major disease. I mean, even in cardiovascular disease, we recognize that, right? How many generations of women with cardiovascular disease did we miss? Because all the signs and symptoms and risks that we put out there were based on the men with cardiovascular disease. We never really studied and understood and advertised kind of what it is for women with rare disease. So I think some of these things that you're talking about here are just so profound, but it really requires us to go all the way back in terms of saying, how do we actually recognize then that this is in fact a very different issue than just equalizing, and how do we get rid of discrimination? How do we make sure that people get the same level of services? And the ability to study specifically, rare diseases and recognizes that for females with that same rare disease, it actually may be quite a different disease. And it doesn't begin to cover, I think, the important issues of people like that Carla been talking about, women who are oftentimes, right, in that role of caregivers, women who are oftentimes taking on that burden. So we've talked about that over and over again. So I'm so delighted to have had the opportunity to hear this conversation, to be part of this conversation. I don't know, with RDI, where we want to go with this next. But I do know that this has been absolutely an important discussion. It's also fundamental, I think, to how do we include people. So, when we look at, people like Rosima, who has been, a scientist, but coming into the field and actually recognized, you say, not just as a woman, but as a high performance scientist in this area. Do we need to be more specific about looking at the issues of gender? Do we need to be the ones that actually say, I mean, I don't know, babe, if you feel the same way. We almost apologize for introducing it. We almost have to kind of say, excuse me, but I'd like you to think about women as well. It's almost an apology still. And I think, do we really need to get beyond that? And it's not, it's nothing to do with us necessarily. It's just so ingrained in us, right? And I would say, no matter how much you think you've made the advances, this forum actually has helped me to understand a whole lot more in terms of how deeply ingrained the issues of gender stigma, discrimination, equity, and gender as a human rights issue still needs to be directly addressed. And it goes back to kind of what Adrian is saying as well. If we want to start the beginning of recognizing what it is that is important in terms of identifying and treating a condition, then we need to start right in that, neonatal area to say, okay, if it's a woman, and sometimes, as you say, a girl, and we recognize that there is a certain condition, do we need to do something a bit more different? Do we not just say, oh, thank God she's only a carrier, so move on? Even in newborn screening, we have this fundamental question right now, and that is, do you diagnose a child with a disorder, right? But in some cases, we don't diagnose the carrier. And, carriers can be men as well as women if we're not talking about excellent conditions, but it's a fundamental question. Do we need to do a better job of being able to, really identify kind of what it is that we need to do in terms of carriers, and how do we actually not just treat them as carriers, but actually having a condition of its own. I think those are the kind of things that we need to move forward. And so that expands into way beyond the gender issue, but maybe having this gender issue helps us to also be able to expand into that area. So I don't want to take over too much of this time here. I know that, we have had such an amazing discussion. I think it gives us, unfortunately, a whole new set of issues that we need to be addressing as we're moving forward. It's what they kind of consider, Flaminia, no good deed goes unpunished. You know, now that we've opened it up and now that we're having the discussion, you know, we really do need to be, I think, working for it. I think it has been a real honor to be able to be part of this, especially, you know, as part of this high level discussion, and really appreciation for the Office of the High Commissioner for, you know, for Human Rights to be a part of discussion, providing that very powerful introduction. And we're hoping that, you know, quite frankly, as we move forward, you know, we go back to saying we had the UN Declaration for Rare Diseases last December. And in there was the social, economic, equity, discrimination kinds of issues. And we recognize in there gender, you know, the gender issues. But I don't think we were really bringing it to the forefront the way that this panel has so powerfully done for us today. Certainly as chair of RDI, I take it as a huge, huge honor that you've kind of brought those messages and have done it so well. So thank you folks very much. And with that, Flaminia, I'm going to turn it over to you to come up with the solutions that we will have in order to address this. So that's what you get for being executive director. Over to you.
Thank you. Not sure we're going to talk about solutions yet, but with the team and with your leadership, Durhane, we're going to consider this seriously. So what can I say? Wow. A huge thank to all of the fantastic speakers today. I think I knew deeply inside that this would be a special meeting, and you all made it special beyond expectations. So we all know that women and girls are often discriminated against in most, if not all, circumstances. And this discrimination is indeed also based on health, as we heard from Anna Peláez. And indeed, it has been aggravated during the COVID pandemic. As we heard throughout the event today, when the health discrimination is due to living with a disease that is rare, whether the disease be visible or invisible, with or without associated disabilities, then rarity adds another intersectional factor to gender inequality. I would like to take a moment to share with you some interesting findings from the survey called Journey to Diagnosis for Persons Living with the Rare Disease, which is a survey conducted through the Rare Barometer, the PLWRD survey program. And I would kindly ask you, please do not share or disseminate any figures on social media or anywhere, as they are still preliminary, and the plan is to publish them officially. So what we know already, though, is that the figures from this survey are statistically significant and can provide robust data to demonstrate that there are gender inequalities in the journey towards diagnosis. So first of all, women receive diagnosis later than men. And the differences are mainly related to the time to get the first symptomatic treatment, the time for being referred to a center of expertise, and the time to obtain a first or a confirmed diagnosis. Also, misdiagnoses are more frequent for women than for men. And I can also speak for myself as a ulcerative colitis patient. This has been the case for me too. So these figures are quite telling, like 46% of women have been diagnosed with another physical disease several times, as opposed to 36% of men. And 51% of women have seen their symptoms neglected, nor taken seriously, considered as psychological, as opposed to 35% of men. How many times did I hear myself, you have to do more yoga class? So there is also another survey. It's from 2017. It's called Enough Care Survey, European-wide survey, with data showing that indeed women spend more time than men caring for the person living with the rare disease in their family, and also more time organizing the care than men, which obviously add to mental load. Now, and this would be most probably my last few comments here, is that indeed we now need to strengthen, as Anna Peláez was mentioning and demonstrated by all of your witnesses, all of your testimonies, sorry, we need to strengthen the institutional response and develop concrete policies based on statistical data. This call, fortunately, very clearly is now included in the recently adopted UN resolution on addressing the challenges of persons living with the rare disease and their families. So to respond to Durhane, where do we want to go with this? We want to go far with this. Thank you very much. And I will leave it maybe up to you, Dolores, just to close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Flaminia and Durhane. And again, an enormous thank you to everyone, to all the speakers, and actually to the virtual audience, to the community at large, I think. I just wrote in the chat, but I'll say it again. This is really the first step in just opening up this discussion, which hasn't been opened up enough. And as Flaminia said, we're going to take this far. I know we will. So this is basically it. Thank you for joining, and let's hope we can bring messages that we've learned today to our private lives, our personal lives, and also to the lives of our communities. Thank you so much, everyone.